The mountains do not care about your experience. They do not care about the expensive glass in your binoculars or the high tensile strength of your climbing rope. In the high country of Montana, the peaks of the crazy mountains rise out of the plains like jagged, broken teeth, stained gray and white with the calcified remains of ancient geological violence. They call them the crazies for a reason. Some say it is because of the way the light hits the ridges at sunset, twisting the shadows into shapes that should not exist. Others say it is the wind which funnels through the canyons until it sounds like 1,000 voices screaming in a language that predates man. I have spent 20 years staring into the abyss of missing persons files, and I can tell you that some places on this earth possess a predatory hunger. Aaron Hedges was a man who knew the high country. He was 40 years old, a seasoned hunter, a man of grit and muscle who understood the weight of a pack and the value of a steady breath. On the 7th of September 2014, he walked into those mountains with 2 friends looking for elk. He never walked out. The trip was supposed to be a week of ritual and endurance. Aaron and his companions were headed for a high-elevation camp, a place where the air is thin and the silence is heavy enough to crush a man. But Aaron was struggling. He was falling behind his lungs, burning his legs heavy with an exhaustion that seemed out of proportion for a man of his fitness. By the time they reached the fork in the trail near Sunlight Peak, it was decided. Aaron would head back down to a lower cache of supplies, a place they called the cow camp, while his friends pushed higher. It was a simple plan, a logical plan. He had a map, a radio, and the sun was still high in the sky. He was supposed to meet them later. He was supposed to be safe. But logic is a thin veil that we drape over a world that is fundamentally illogical. When Aaron turned his back on his friends and began his descent toward the cache, he was stepping off the map of the known world and into a pocket of reality where the rules of physics and survival begin to fray at the edges. By the following morning, the worry began to set in like a slow-moving frost. Aaron never arrived at the cow camp. He never checked in. The mountains were suddenly gripped by a freak early-season blizzard, a wall of white death that hammered the ridges with snow and wind. This is a recurring theme in these cases. The moment a person becomes separated, the weather turns hostile, as if the environment itself is trying to erase the evidence of a crime. The search and rescue teams that eventually mobilized were some of the best in the country. They brought in helicopters with thermal imaging dogs trained to catch the scent of a single skin cell on the wind, and hundreds of ground searchers who combed every square inch of the drainage. They found nothing. For days, the mountains were silent. No smoke from a signal fire. No tracks in the fresh snow. It was as if Aaron Hedges had simply evaporated. His physical form dissolved into the mist and the granite. It was not until the following year that the first pieces of the puzzle began to surface, and they were pieces that did not fit any known picture of human behavior. Searchers found Aaron's boots. They were sitting near a creek miles away from where he should have been. Now you have to understand the psychology of a man in the wilderness. Your boots are your life. They are the only things standing between you and the jagged, bone-breaking reality of the terrain. A seasoned hunter does not take off his boots in the middle of a mountain range unless he has lost his mind or is being compelled by something we do not understand. There was no blood. There were no signs of a struggle. The boots were just sitting there abandoned. Near the boots they found his water bladder. It was empty. There was a cache of supplies nearby that he had clearly accessed, but he had taken things he didn't need and left behind things that would have saved his life. He was behaving like a man caught in the grip of a profound neurological collapse, or perhaps a man who was being toyed with by a force that finds human survival instincts amusing. The distance Aaron traveled is where the story moves from tragic to impossible. To get from the point where he was last seen to the location where his gear was found, he would have had to traverse some of the most vertical, punishing terrain in the lower 48 states. He would have had to climb over ridges that defy the capabilities of an unequipped hiker moving through the night through a blizzard without his primary gear. And he did it all while moving away from safety, away from the trails, and toward the most inhospitable corners of the range. This is what I call the zigzag of the damned. We see it time and time again. The victim moves in a pattern that suggests they are being herded, pushed toward a specific destination by something that stays just out of sight, just beyond the frequency of human hearing. There are theories about infrasound, low-frequency vibrations, caused by wind hitting specific rock formations that can induce feelings of dread, nausea, and total disorientation. Perhaps the mountains themselves were screaming at him in a voice he couldn't hear, but his lizard brain couldn't ignore. In June of 2016, nearly 2 years after he disappeared, the final chapter of Aaron Hedges was written. His remains were found on the opposite side of the mountain range, miles and miles away on a piece of private property. He was found by a rancher. He was miles from his boots, miles from his last known position, and at an elevation that made no sense for a man who was supposedly trying to find his way home. His clothes were scattered. His skull was found some distance from his torso. The investigators pointed to scavengers, to the natural process of decay and the harsh Montana winters, but they couldn't explain how he got there. To reach that spot, Aaron would have had to perform a feat of mountaineering that would challenge a professional athlete in peak condition with full gear. He did it in the middle of a blizzard, likely barefoot, or in socks with no food and no fire. It is a physical impossibility. It is a spatial anomaly that defies the very nature of the landscape. When you look at the map of the crazy mountains and plot the points of Aaron's journey, the lines don't form a path of a man lost. They form the path of a man who was displaced. It is as if he was picked up by a giant hand and dropped into a different coordinate, his mind shattered by the transition. We see this in the high pockets of the Pacific Northwest, in the deep woods of the Smokies, and in the granite islands of the Sierras. People disappear in one spot and reappear often deceased, in a location they could not have possibly reached on foot. There is a specific type of silence that accompanies these finds. A silence that the local authorities are often quick to fill with talk of hypothermia and paradoxical undressing. They say the brain gets hot when it's freezing and the victim strips off their clothes. But that doesn't explain the distance. It doesn't explain the missing items. It doesn't explain why the dogs, the most sophisticated biological sensors we have, can't find a scent, even when the victim is only a few hundred yards away. There is something in those mountains that doesn't like us. We are intruders in a cathedral of stone that was built for a different kind of inhabitant. When Aaron Hedges turned that corner in 2014, he might have stepped through a thin spot in the world. He might have encountered something that looked like a man but wasn't, or a sound that stripped his consciousness down to the shivering marrow. The crazies kept him for 2 years, and when they were done with him, they spat him out on a hillside where he could finally be found, a broken warning to anyone else who thinks they can conquer the high country. We like to think we are the apex predators, that our technology and our maps make us safe. But the maps only show the surface. They don't show the layers beneath the hidden folds of the earth where people go to vanish. The case of Aaron Hedges remains a jagged wound in the history of Montana search and rescue. It is a story with no satisfying ending, only a series of increasingly disturbing questions. How does a man lose his boots and keep walking for miles over sharp scree? Why did he bypass houses and roads to head deeper into the vertical wilderness? What was he running from, or what was he being pulled toward? The official files are closed. The cause of death, listed as undetermined or attributed to the elements, but the elements do not act with such calculated cruelty. The elements do not hide a man from thermal cameras and then place him on a hillside 2 years later like a trophy. We are left with the silence of the peaks and the cold wind that still blows through the canyons of the crazies, carrying with it the echoes of those who never came home. This pattern of impossible travel and discarded clothing is not unique to the crazy mountains. Consider the disappearance of Jaryd Atadero in the mountains of Colorado. A 3-year-old boy who vanished on a trail surrounded by adults only for his remains and his clothing to be found, years later thousands of feet up a sheer cliff face that even expert climbers struggled to ascend. His pants were turned inside out, and his shoes were in pristine condition despite the years of exposure. Like Hedges, the geography of the find was a physical impossibility. We see it again with the case of Keith Parkins in Oregon, a young boy who traveled miles over mountain ridges in a matter of hours, a distance that grown men could not cover in the same time frame. These are not accidents. These are not simple cases of getting lost. There is a thread that connects these people, a thread that leads into the dark, unmapped corners of our world where the shadows have teeth and the mountains have a memory. Sleep well if you can, but remember that the wilderness does not need a reason to take you. It only needs an opportunity. The silence of the crazy mountains is not the silence of a sleeping world. It is a heavy, pressurized quiet that sits in your ear canals like lead. When you stand on those jagged ridges of the Gallatin National Forest, you can feel the weight of the granite pressing against the sky. It is a place of sharp angles and sudden drops, where the weather can turn from a golden autumn afternoon to a blinding razor-edged blizzard in the span of 20 minutes. In September 2014, Aaron Hedges walked into that cathedral of stone with the confidence of a man who knew the terrain. He was an experienced hunter, a man of 44 years who understood the rhythm of the high country. He had his gear, his radio, and his companions. But the crazies do not care about experience. They do not care about your maps or your high-end camouflage. There is a specific kind of dread that settles in when a man simply uncouples from reality and drifts into the grey. Aaron was supposed to meet his friends at a specific cache, a point on the map that should have been an easy hike. He never made it. Instead, he began a journey that defies every law of logic and human endurance. The search began almost immediately, a massive mobilization of men, dogs, and machines. We are talking about hundreds of volunteers' helicopters with thermal imaging that could spot a field mouse from 1,000 feet up, and K9 units trained to find a scent in a hurricane. They found nothing. For days, then weeks, the mountain held its breath. It was as if the earth had opened up a seam and swallowed him whole, closing the dirt behind him without leaving a single scar. The searchers looked at the maps and saw a void. They walked the grid lines until their boots were shredded and their spirits were broken, but Aaron Hedges had slipped through the cracks of the world. The first crack in the mystery appeared when they found his gear. It was scattered in a way that made no sense to the investigators. His water bottle and his bow were found in a spot that he had no reason to visit. Then came the boots. This is the detail that keeps veteran searchers awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what kind of madness takes hold in the high peaks. They found his boots miles away from his last known position. They were sitting there side by side, as if he had simply stepped out of them and continued his journey in his stocking feet. Think about that for a moment. Try to imagine walking across miles of volcanic scree, sharp granite shards, and frozen tundra without any protection for your feet. The pain would be white hot and immediate. Every step would involve the tearing of flesh and the crushing of bone. And yet there was no blood. There were no signs of a struggle. Just two empty boots staring back at the sun. When a man loses his boots in the wilderness, he is usually in the final stages of hypothermia. The brain begins to misfire, and a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing takes over. The victim feels as though they are burning up, and they strip away their clothes in a desperate attempt to cool down even as the frost is killing them. But that does not explain the distance. It does not explain how a man in that state of physical collapse can navigate across vertical terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. Aaron Hedges did not just wander. He moved with a terrifying singular purpose. He bypassed roads that would have led him to safety. He walked past ranch houses where the lights were on and the heat was running. He turned his back on civilization and headed higher, deeper into the heart of the crazies. It is as if he was being summoned by a frequency that only he could hear. 2 years passed. 2 years of snow and wind and the slow grind of the seasons. In 2016, a rancher on the other side of the mountain range found what was left. Aaron Hedges had finally come home, or at least the mountain was done with him. He was found on a steep hillside miles and miles away from where he had first vanished. The location was a physical impossibility. To get from the spot where his boots were found to the hillside where his remains were discovered, he would have had to cross multiple high-altitude ridges and navigate terrain that was essentially vertical. He would have had to do this in the dark in the snow without shoes. The search teams had flown over this exact spot dozens of times with thermal cameras during the initial disappearance. They had found nothing. No heat signature, no movement, no sign of life. The condition of the remains was equally disturbing. His clothing was found, but it was not worn in a way that suggested a man dying of exposure. Some items were turned inside out. Some were tucked away as if they had been carefully placed. There is a theory among those of us who track these cases that there is something in the woods that mimics our reality. Something that looks at a human being and sees a puzzle to be taken apart and reassembled in a way that doesn't quite fit. We call it the predator or the anomaly or the silence. It is a force that operates on a different set of physics. It can move a body through solid rock or hold it in a pocket of time for years before dropping it back into our world. When Aaron was found, he was a shell. The mountain had stripped away everything that made him a man and left behind a collection of bones and fabric that posed more questions than they answered. The official report will tell you he died of the elements. It is a clean, easy phrase that allows the bureaucrats to close the file and go home to their families. But the elements do not act with this kind of calculated malice. The wind does not take your boots and set them neatly on a rock. The snow does not hide you from a $5 million thermal imaging system and then reveal you 2 years later on a hillside that had been searched a dozen times. There is a mechanical cruelty to these disappearances. It is as if the victims are being toyed with by an entity that finds our struggle for survival amusing. We look at the mountains and see beauty, but that beauty is a mask. Beneath the trees and the meadows is a hunger that has existed since the earth was cooling. I have spent years looking into these cases, and the pattern is always the same. It starts with a momentary lapse in attention. A hunter steps behind a tree. A hiker stops to tie a shoe. A child wanders 10 feet off the trail. In that heartbeat, the world shifts. The familiar landmarks become alien. The sun seems to hang in the wrong part of the sky. The birds stop singing. That is the warning. If you ever find yourself in the woods and the sound suddenly dies. If the air feels thick and tastes like copper, you are standing on the edge of the void. Aaron Hedges likely felt that shift. He likely turned around to find his friends and found only a wall of grey mist and a silence that felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. He started walking, and he didn't stop until his heart gave out on a hillside he should never have been able to reach. This pattern of impossible travel is a recurring nightmare in the archives of the missing. We see it in the case of Jaryd Atadero, a 3-year-old boy who vanished in the mountains of Colorado in 1999. He was on a trail with a group of adults just a few feet away, and then he was gone. There was no scream, no sound of a struggle. For 4 years, the earth held on to him. When his remains were finally found, they were thousands of feet up a sheer cliff face. To reach that spot, a toddler would have had to climb a vertical wall of rock that professional mountaineers find difficult. His little fleece jacket was found, and his shoes were in near-perfect condition, despite 4 years of Colorado winters. The official explanation was a mountain lion, but mountain lions do not leave shoes in pristine condition, and they do not carry their prey up vertical cliffs to leave them like trophies on a ledge. We see it again in the case of Keith Parkins, who disappeared in Oregon in the middle of the 20th century. He was a young boy who vanished from his yard and was found 19 hours later nearly 20 miles away. He had traveled over multiple mountain ridges and through dense forest in a time frame that would be impossible for an Olympic athlete, let alone a small child. When he was found, he was face down in the snow, alive but in a catatonic state. He could not explain how he had traveled that distance. He could not explain why he was missing his clothes. These cases are the jagged teeth of the wilderness. They show us that our understanding of geography and time is fragile. There are places in this country where the map is just a suggestion, and the real terrain is something much darker and more predatory. The case of Aaron Hedges is a warning. It tells us that the high country is not our home. We are tourists in a land that belongs to something older and much less kind. When you look at the photos of the crazy mountains, you see the majesty of the peaks, but I want you to look closer. I want you to see the shadows and the draws. I want you to see the way the light bends around the edges of the granite. There is a presence there that does not want to be found. It is a force that watches and waits for the moment when your guard is down. It waits for you to turn that corner, to lose your boots, to walk until your feet are shredded and your mind is gone. The mountains have a memory, and they do not forget the taste of those who wander too far into the grey. As we sit in our lighted rooms and look at our screens, we feel safe. We think that we have conquered the world because we have satellites in orbit and GPS in our pockets. But Aaron Hedges had gear. He had friends. He had a map. None of it mattered. When the mountain decided to take him, the technology failed. The radios went silent. The thermal cameras saw only cold stone. We are still living in the age of the campfire, huddling together against a darkness that we cannot name. The wilderness is not a park. It is not a playground. It is a vast, unmapped intelligence that operates on a timeline of eons, not hours. It can wait 2 years to return a body. It can wait a century to reveal a secret. The files on these cases often end with a whimper. Undetermined. Accidental exposure. Misadventure. These are the words that the authorities use to cover the hole in the center of the story. They are words meant to soothe the public and keep the tourism dollars flowing into the national parks. But if you talk to the searchers, the ones who were actually there, they will tell you a different story. They will tell you about the tracks that simply stop in the middle of an open field. They will tell you about the feeling of being watched by something that isn't a bear or a mountain lion. They will tell you about the silence. That specific heavy silence that preceded the disappearance of Aaron Hedges. We are left with the echoes. The echo of a hunter's call that was never answered. The echo of a child's footsteps on a cliff face he could never have climbed. The thread that connects these stories is one of impossibility. It is a thread that leads away from the trail and into the thickets where the shadows have teeth. We like to think we are the masters of our domain, but the cases of Hedges, Atadero, and Parkins prove otherwise. They are the proof that there are predators in this world that do not hunt for meat. They hunt for something else. They hunt for the soul or the energy, or perhaps they just hunt for the sake of the game. When you head out into the woods, remember the boots of Aaron Hedges. Remember the way they were left behind empty and silent on a mountain that refused to give up its secrets. Remember that the map you are holding is only a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional nightmare. The Earth has layers, and sometimes those layers shift. Sometimes a person falls through. If you feel that shift, if you hear that silence, do not stop to look back. Do not stop to tie your shoe. Just run. Run until you see the lights of a house, until you hear the sound of a car, until you are back in the world of men. Because the wilderness does not need a reason to take you. It only needs an opportunity, and once it has you, it may not let you go for a very long time. Sleep well if you can. But when you close your eyes, try not to think about the high country. Try not to think about the wind blowing through the canyons of the crazies carrying the scent of pine and something much older. The pattern is there, hidden in the statistics and the search logs, waiting for someone to notice. We are just the investigators, the ones who pick through the remains and try to make sense of the senseless. But the mountains don't care about our investigations. They are still there, standing tall against the night, waiting for the next hunter to turn the corner and step into the thin spot. The world is much larger and much more terrifying than we dare to admit. And Aaron Hedges is just one more name on a list that is growing every single day.